Hello, welcome to this tutorial where I'm going to show you the right or the best way that you can be able to render from Blender. And when I say the right way, I'm talking about a way whereby you can render your images and you can have the liberty of being able to edit them and be stress free. So there are so many ways in which there are two main parts when it comes to rendering the right way in Blender that we're going to be considering. But the first part, you're going to consider the format in which you're going to render, and then the second part, you're going to consider the color spaces in which you're going to do the rendering. So let's start. So here in Blender, I have set up this very basic scene, but in the first part, when it comes to rendering, that we have to consider is that we have to come here to this part where it says scene, and then in the scene part we need to use a certain type of color space, which is by the way, by default Blender usually has this color space. Well, I see it doesn't do any changes right now because I was already here, but by default Blender used to have this color space over here, this sRGB. So sRGB used to produce images, but they're just basic, they're just basic images. So let alone a new feature was actually implemented in Blender, and it was called Filmic Blender. So this Filmic Blender, essentially what it does, and I will show you later on what I mean. Essentially what it does, it creates cinematic images. When I say cinematic images, what do I mean? And what do I mean when I also say the word cinematic? Cinematic is something that resembles what we see in the cinema. So before, when we had this sRGB color space, images when they were produced, they were very not easy for you to be able to do massive color grading upon them. So you're mostly just stuck with the basic color grading options. But with this option of having this Filmic Blender, it has added two things. The first one, it has added we call them stops of light or dynamic range, and I'm not really going to talk much about this dynamic range because the whole purpose for me to create this course was to simplify. I just tell you do this, I'll tell you what it does, but I don't want to go too technical and start confusing those who are very new to Blender. So essentially what you have to do, after you have installed Filmic Blender, or perhaps if you're using Blender, a newer version of Blender beyond Blender 2.78, it comes with Filmic Blender by default. So when you come here to color management, all you have to do, you have to come and select this Filmic log encoding. And when you come to Filmic loading encoding, you come also here to this other part where it says view. You also select here Filmic log encoding, in any case if it hasn't been selected. So there's one thing maybe perhaps you have been noticing if you watch behind the scenes of famous movies and how they show you the befores and after. There's this thing whereby they usually show you, for example here, as in this image, they show you before it was color graded and here after it was color graded. And you maybe perhaps you have asked yourself why professionals usually prefer to have images like this produced out of the camera, but the reason why they prefer this format is because it has a lot of I just call it color space. It has a lot of space whereby you can have the liberty of changing it to almost any kind of color without the image breaking. When I say image breaking, I'm talking about something called they're called JPEG artifacts. So JPEG artifacts is when you force a color grade on an image and then the image, it's essentially it breaks. So the best way for you to be able to have freedom in the color grading process is for you to render images that look flat, like this one. The flatter the better, because the more flat and ugly looking it is, the more freedom you'll have in playing with it in the color grading process, and you'll see why in the color grading tutorial. So after you've selected that, there's this also setting after you selected Filmic log encoding here and Filmic log encoding base here, you come to this part where it says look. What kind of look do you want? For if you want to do extensive color grading processes later on, I would highly recommend that you select this very, very low contrast. But I'll also show you what it means when I go to low contrast. You'll see that whiteness on the image, it's like it's disappearing. So essentially what I'm doing is like I'm removing that ability. That, you remember, that whiteness is the ability for an image to be played with. So I'm like reducing that ability for the image to be played with. And if I go to base contrast, this is like the medium point, and very high contrast, this is like where you already have the contrast. But what I recommend that you should do when you're rendering out your image is you should come here and select this very low contrast. So by selecting very low contrast and having this very flat image, which is similar to what professional use here, like you can see here in the Matrix, or in this movie, or in this movie over here, is that it gives you freedom in the color grading process. It's very hard for me to tell you how much freedom it gives you right now, but it just gives you so much freedom. You can change from cinematic color to very romantic color without having the fear that there's this thing. Maybe perhaps if you have experienced it or not, when I have experienced it, because I was usually shooting movies with regular cameras, which doesn't have this feature. So when you color grade, the image starts to break, and so essentially that's it. I don't want to confuse you with the technical part, but the best way that you have to render an image, the first way is to use this Filmic log encoding. And then the second part, when you're rendering here in the rendering format, when you come here to the output, is that you should render in images sequence. And the best image sequence, if you are on a very, very, very if you're on a very, let's say, high budget, or let's say very, I call them sensitive project, the best format is usually this one, OpenEXR. But in my experience, this is a very, very useful format, but in my experience, this file format usually has a lot of data and data. In my experience, in using this, I never really actually needed that extra power that it gave me, so I was usually stuck with this PNG. And also I didn't like the fact that it produced a lot, very, very big size files, and then I just didn't have, I didn't see the importance of that high data. But anyway, in medium scale, I can say you just need this PNG. There's really no big difference. All I did here was take the compression away, take it to 0. If you're using Blender, you might find this somewhere around, I don't know, maybe, I don't remember the default where it is right now, but all I did was set this compression to 0 and the color depth to 16, and then I use this RGBA in case I want to use with an alpha or a transparent background. Maybe I want to do some compositing later on, so that's what I usually do. But another thing which I usually do is that like I said, I render in image sequences. So as you can see here, if I'm rendering in image sequences, we can see how this is what it does. And this image, by the way, has been rendered in that filmmaking log encoding. You'll see it in the color grading tutorial, whereby it's transformed and it starts shining. But so essentially, this is what I do: render in image sequences. This has two advantages. The first advantage is that if a file crashes, if it crashes by any, or if there's a power outage and there's no electricity, what Blender will do, it will resume from the frame whereby it ended. And what do I do so that it can resume from a frame where it ended? What I usually do, you see this button over here, it says overwrite. What does it mean? It means if a file, let's say, crashes before the rendering was finished, if you have this enabled, which you shouldn't, you should have it disabled. what it does, it will re-render all the files. But if you don't have it enabled, this is what it does. Like if like the way here, I don't have it enabled, this is what it does. It goes to the folder, it looks at the last frame that was rendered, and then it starts rendering from that frame onwards. But if you have it enabled, which you shouldn't, I don't know why it's here by default, but if you have it enabled, and then the file crashed, and then and then what essentially does, it starts rendering from the very first frame here. But when I have it disabled, it just comes here, looks at the folder, and then it selects that the final frame. It starts rendering from the last frame that it was active. So as you can see here, you can select the folder where you want to put it. This is the default folder. Most people are usually confused by where do the files go. So you can, when you select that, you can put it wherever you want, or you can just leave it here like the way I have done. That is it's your own choice. So that is where you select where you want the file to be rendered to. And exactly, so that is like the right or the most correct way for you to render the files from Blender. So there are two principles. The principle number one, render in image sequence. Do not select these movie sequences over here. Render in image sequences. And I prefer PNG because it's almost like the best of the ones that are here. It's not the best, it's the best that has the most features. The best is this one, OpenEXR, but this one is the best of both worlds. I get low file sizes, and then I also have a lot of detail in the image. So those are and also the another thing is this thing, when you come to rendering, you should have this enabled Filmic login coding. Then you should have this thing. If you plan to do a lot of color grading later on, you should have this set to very low contrast. It gives you freedom to play with the image later on. So that's it. Thank you for watching this tutorial. See you in the next tutorial. Yeah, this is the Animation Factory.